Hey everybody, hope that everybody's doing well and at this rapid fire pace of a 6 week summer class. um, I'm sure we're already exhausted, but hopefully, I mean, I've certainly been energized by your guys' hard work, the conversations and discussion boards and invention post discussion boards, and even some of the conversation in these video workshops. And so this third week brings us already to, well, at the end of this week we'll be halfway through the course, or midway through this week we'll be halfway through the class, which is sort of alarming, but is obviously the reason for the sort of rapid fire pace. So without any further ado, and to try not to take up too much time but still give you as much as I can in terms of setting the context for our new module, um, let me turn right to the Google slideshow, and that way I can also put on captions, because I realized that the captions do not record. The Zoom-based captions do not record, um, but the Google slide captions do record. So, without further ado, let me get into the slideshow here. Share my screen. Go into present. Give me 1 second. Um, this happens to me every time. And I see we should, okay, good. We have the captions. So obviously with week 3, what this brings us to is a new module called Unreal Truths. And that's sort of a ironic, maybe perhaps a contradiction in terms, but hopefully what I'm going to do, and it's of course, my titles tend to be, I don't know, maybe I'm a little too cute with my titles, and I apologize for that. But there is something of an unreal truth to what we're looking at with this module. This module, we're shifting both away from personal narratives. So we, spent the past 2 weeks really sort of clicking away on those personal narratives, and you guys did some great work. And I hope that a few things come to light in terms of insights about how personal narratives work, how they can be valuable in a variety of sort of communicative situations beyond just like a fiction situation. Um, so it's been great to work through that. But this module, our second module, we are going to do a critical analysis, which is a central claim and subclaim driven argumentative analysis. So probably a lot like a paper you wrote in 105. And it's a we're going to be focusing in on a critical analysis of a documentary film or series. So I'm going to talk a little bit about today. We're going to go over the M2 overview, of course. I'm going to, of course, lay out the sort of week ahead of us this week, as I always do in these video workshops. And then we'll also sort of think a little bit about what documentary films and series are, what defines a documentary. Now, in the background of all this, and that something you should keep in mind, is that you need to start looking for a documentary that you want to write about. You'll have a little better sense of maybe what documentaries will make for an effective argumentative analysis, hopefully by the end of this video workshop. But so, maybe you've seen a documentary or two recently that you're interested in. We're only going to be writing about one, but our first discussion board will actually be talking about 2 different ideas of documentaries, just to sort of test out 2 different ideas. But ultimately, we're going to want to choose one documentary. I would say you're going to want to have an idea of which documentary you're going to write about by the end of this week. So if you can, take some time and watch a bunch of different trailers of documentaries, or if you've seen some documentaries recently, maybe think through how one of those documentaries might be a good focus for your essay. So that's sort of behind the scenes. There isn't like a direct assignment about that, but my recommendation is to try and find a documentary to focus in on for our next essay soon. But so with this week 3, the 12th through the 18th of July, learning goals. The first learning goal is really just to go over the M2 overview, understand what we're doing for the second module, and then talk about documentaries to build our understanding of documentaries and select one to focus in upon for our M2 essay. And so obviously the M2 overview is going to help us do that. We're also doing a reading, another reading in perusal, where we're going to comment actually twice. The last reading we only commented once, but here we're going to comment twice. And remember, you can reply to other people's questions or comments within perusal. So if you that counts towards a comment or reply. And then we also, of course, have this video workshop, which hopefully will teach us a little bit more about documentaries. The other learning goal for this week is to start to dive in a little bit on filmic analysis. What does it mean to analyze a film or a television show or a television series, whatever, documentary series? Um, and it's what is known as a rhetorical analysis, meaning that we're going to be focusing in on different elements of the film we choose, or the documentary we choose, I should say, and analyzing how those elements impact the audience, right, the viewer. So it's called a rhetorical analysis. Don't worry about that fancy word, but that's what we're sort of going to be developing a little bit of understanding of, at least starting this week, and then really developing that much more next week and week 4. And so we have a discussion board called DB3 Double Takes. That's our third discussion board, class-wide discussion board. And that's going to ask you to sort of analyze or think about 2 different documentary films you might be interested in writing about, and start to do a little bit of sort of critical thinking about what interests you, what do you think the message is. And so that'll get us a little bit into that. And then we're going to have M2 invention posts for this module. Boy, and I don't know if I'm going to be able to remember everybody off the top of my head. In fact, I'm not going to say a bunch of names because then I don't want to get it wrong. So I don't want to scare some people. But obviously, those of you who are doing M2, are doing invention posts for this module, you will receive an email from me later tonight or early tomorrow morning, and it'll prepare you for that. So there's only 7 students who are doing invention posts. And for their invention posts, they're going to be due at the end of Friday night. They're going to be sort of doing a close look at whatever documentary they think they're going to write about, so we can sort of see and workshop and help them build their ideas, as well as sort of think to ourselves, like what kind of ideas we can sort of get inspired from that are in those invention posts. Okay, so let's take a look at the M2 overview. And I just sort of copied and pasted I just screenshotted the M2 overview here so we could have the captions as I read through this. So I'm going to go ahead and read through this. I might read a little quickly. Obviously, you want to take the time to read through this, but just to sort of set the scene of documentary films. So if we were to point to one specific spark that set the world ablaze in global protests for racial justice in 2020, it would be a 10-minute video filmed by 17-year-old Darnella Frazier on May 25th of the brutal killing of George Floyd at the hands of Minneapolis police. While the video showed a reality that many already knew about, the video forced many others to see a reality of racial injustice that they either denied or had the privilege to ignore. For filming the video, Darnella has been called, quote, the Rosa Parks of her generation, for bringing to light a reality that has motivated so many to fight for social change. Of course, the video isn't only a journalistic representation of fact. It's a narrative, a story both personal in terms of George Floyd and Derek Chauvin as individuals, and allegorical in terms of the racism and brutality that people of color have suffered throughout the history of this country. In this sense, Darnella Frazier's short video encapsulates the ambition of most documentary filmmakers, not, quote, simply to register events and circumstances, but to find the most moving examples of social problems so as to expose a reality less known and motivate an audience towards social change. So notice there, what I'm talking about is that documentary films are really are activistic, if that, I'm not even sure that's a word, but they're a form of activism, right? Documentaries are an attempt to motivate people to understand something that maybe they don't understand so well, or see something that maybe is hidden from view. They surface the realities of our world that sort of get ignored or are not being paid attention to enough in order to sort of motivate people. So they're both sort of forms of activism as well as they're forms of argument, right? In many cases, so many of you have probably seen the documentary Super Size Me. And obviously there's an argument that Morgan Spurlock, the director and producer and the main character in that film, that documentary, his argument is obviously something about how McDonald's and fast food is something that is really killing all of us. Um, how effectively he makes that argument with all his dramatic techniques and everything is a whole nother point. That's what we're going to be thinking about. But in many ways, documentary films are activistic in that sense. And maybe I just made up that word activistic, but so I think that's important to keep in mind. Instead of an idea of a documentary film just simply being like, oh, I'm just going to record something, and it's just the actuality. Pretty much anytime you film something, you're presenting a point of view. You're presenting how you're looking at it, even though it's a objective quote unquote camera. You're holding that camera. You're deciding when to turn that camera on, when to turn it off. If I'm creating a documentary about, you know, um, here we have a documentary that was really about the protests in Ferguson, Missouri, right? I'm choosing people to interview. I'm choosing particular footage to include. I'm choosing, the music. I'm choosing all these things. I'm building a kind of argument. I'm trying to build this. I'm creating a message, right? So those are important things to keep in mind. To wit, philosopher John Dewey insists that the cornerstone of a democracy is an informed public who can come together in times of crisis for the larger social good. But this coming together is only possible if, quote, we have a way to communicate with each other about the shared problems we face. At their best, documentary film is that communication that can give us back our streets. Um, at the end of 2016, Oxford Dictionaries named post-truth their word of the year. So you can see here, I'm sort of setting up the context that we're living in now, confirming how confirmation bias and alternative facts have become a routine part of our contemporary experience. Perhaps the most important implication of this fake news age is how we, as the public, have apparently lost reliable sources for truth, sources that don't try to convince an audience of the truth of one singular viewpoint or perspective, but utilize sustained critical inquiry to promote our individual thinking and active involvement with social issues. What I'm basically saying there is, it's not to say that some documentary series are very propagandistic, right? The nature of propaganda is to get you to think one way about something. Um, some documentaries do that, right? And sometimes they break down because it becomes so obvious that they're so biased in their perspective that they don't even let in any other viewpoints or possibilities of thinking any other way. Um, so they can become what I call kind of propagandistic. And in my opinion, those are documentaries that aren't effective at inspiring critical inquiry. And you're more than welcome to write it. Like if you wanted to write about a documentary film that you feel is like way over the top and way overblown and criticize it for that, then absolutely you could do a critical analysis of that. Of course, you can also write a positive analysis of a documentary and saying how it does a great job of getting us to sort of see multiple viewpoints, engage with the issue in a more complicated and challenging way. Um, so um, let me go back. So that we've lost reliable sources of truth, sources. So that propagandistic thing, so much of news, especially major network news, right, corporate funded news, is so imbued with a particular political position, right? And it's usually either highly conservative or liberal, right? And so documentaries usually, again, like I said, it's not to say that all documentaries are objective, or even that some documentaries don't have very liberal or very conservative viewpoints. They absolutely do. But effective critical inquiry would be one that allows for multiple viewpoints and perspectives, even beyond an idea of liberal and conservative, whatever. It would allow for a more critical engagement with the issues. So it's no surprise then the popularity of documentary film and programs has steadily risen since the turn of the 21st century, with 2016 representing the second highest number ever of domestic releases of documentary films, and 2018 yielding the highest gross in ticket sales for documentaries in recent memory, prompting the Center for Media and Social Impact to call our era the golden era of documentary filmmaking. It seems only to make sense then, in an age of increasing activism and desire for meaningful change, that our stories would push for social activism, a social realism in the form of documentaries. As documentary filmmaker Joshua Oppenheimer states, quote, because investigative journalism has been cut in American media, nonfiction filmmakers, and he means documentary filmmakers, easily take on the duty of going out and pursuing deep investigations that are based on our gut feeling that if people were allowed to see freely, they would see truly, perceiving their world as open to scrutiny and evaluation. So, of course, we have the prompt here. Our task for the second module is to select a contemporary documentary film or series and analyze how its message about a certain social issue, effectively or not, allows for critical engagement with that issue. So you'll notice a few things here. We're both sort of analyzing what we think is the message of the film about a particular social issue. Whether it's about issues of race or class or materialism or technology or the internet or sexuality or religion and spirituality or about politics or about art or about food or about the food industry or about the fashion industry or whatever it might be. Um, we're trying to sort of focusing focus our paper by choosing one documentary, focusing in on the primary, what we feel is the primary social issue at stake there, and then also not just interpreting what we think is the message of the film about that issue, but also whether or not you feel it's effective. We're making a kind of judgment and evaluation, whether or not you feel it is effective at getting audiences to sort of critically engage with that issue. So like I say, once again, we will use our activities and assignments throughout this module to help us explore the purpose and variations of documentary filmmaking, as well as consider the rhetorical techniques that documentary films use to create their messages and make their arguments, so we can better determine in our individual arguments what critical engagement means and how it is effectively produced or not by our selected documentary film. Now, with the other half of the overview, right, I give us a little bit of a definition of what documentary is. And I'm going to go through that in the following slides. So I'm not going to sort of go through this here, but you should obviously read through this. I'm going to do a version of what I say here in just a couple minutes with my other slides. But also, I give you multiple links here. Almost every streaming service now has a category for documentaries. You can find tons of documentaries for free online if you have a Netflix. Netflix has been a huge producer of documentaries. HBO has been, Hulu even, and they've actually opened up a whole new sort of market and tapped into a whole new market of documentary films. So they're everywhere, and they're really sort of popular. And I think, sort of like I said, with the context of our society, rightly so. Um, so let's talk a little bit then about, so you see multiple links there. Those aren't obviously the end all be all of lists of documentaries, but those are great places to start. Um, so let's take a little bit about what I mean by documentary, right? So what do we know about documentary films already? And this might be a question that you could bring up in the video workshop discussion. You could say like, well, I used to think of documentary films as this or documentary series as this. Now I realize that maybe they involve this or that. So Film Scholar and the reading that we're doing, that documentary in a post-truth age, in Perusal, there's this quote from Henrik Jewell that proclaims that we seem to know quite well and instantaneously a documentary when we see it. Um, but why is this? How do we know a documentary when we see it? Well, I think they're extraordinarily popular, like I said, right now. So really popular documentaries that are out there. You don't have to write about a really popular documentary, but The Social Dilemma, 13th, Time, and Blackfish are four documentaries that have been extraordinarily popular and impactful. Um, and have won multiple awards. So obviously dealing with a wide variety of social issues. Well, 13th and Time are kind of dealing with the justice system from two different angles. 13th is thinking about the justice system as a kind of continuation of slavery in our society, and obviously talking about the 13th Amendment. So it's really coming at the justice system and the prison system, the incarceration system, from a systemic angle, while Time is thinking more about the effect that this biased justice system has upon families, in particular families of color. So, Social Dilemma, which you may have heard about, is all about, I mean, you can see the tagline there, the technology that connects us also controls us, is a really sort of detailed look at the way in which the role of social media and the internet and cell phones in our lives, in particular in our lives, and the ways in which they, at least from their perspective, they have a pretty um, they have a clear argument and a point of view that maybe it's not so good, all this social media. And then Blackfish was a documentary, of course, was a kind of whistleblower documentary, if you will, about SeaWorld and the way in which they didn't take great care, to say the least, of their killer whales, their orcas. So it was sort of kind of an animal rights social issue at stake there. So we know a documentary when we see it, says Jewel. They're out there, they're everywhere right now in our society. And one thing we probably know is that they're about real people and real events. I think this is really important to keep in mind. It's not that there aren't some fiction films that are about real people and real events. Those have been really popular in terms of fiction films. So, you have the film about, the story of Queen, you have the film The Green Book, you have the film um, about World War One. I think it's called 1914. Where been popularity. There's fiction films based on true events, but those are not documentaries. But one thing that is for sure that a documentary is, it's about real people and real events. And the Oxford English Dictionary defines a documentary as a movie, television show, or radio program that provides a factual record or report. I think that definition is a little problematic, though, because of what I said already. That a documentary isn't necessarily just the presentation of facts. You're right. You're choosing facts, right? Morgan Spurlock is choosing various statistics about diabetes and about health related to diet. When he's trying to make a critique of McDonald's and the fast food industry. So a mechanical type of recording and displaying video does not make one a documentary filmmaker, right? Simply just recording something. We need to see some point of view, a message of some sort, a moral or ideological ambition with the film made. In short, a wish to make a difference, to change the world, or at least the way in which some relevant audience will look upon the world or themselves. So notice here, that's where I'm talking about that kind of activist impulse within documentary films. It isn't just saying, hey, let's record one day in the life of so and so. Most likely that one day in the life of so and so is going to have some sort of tell us something about our world, tell us something about our society, reveal to us, for example, the ways in which, the working class are just struggling day in and day out just to keep their nose above water. And it's going to have that sense of point of view, right? So it isn't just as simple as some objective recording of, a city street. There's always going to be, in a documentary, some sort of point of view. Now, they're also, like I said, they're not objective fact. They have a point of view. So documentaries are produced with the purpose of presenting a truth, whereas a fiction film or fiction films are in pursuit of the art of storytelling and entertainment. Fiction films ask us for a suspension of disbelief. In other words, not to concern ourselves with accuracy, whereas a documentary wants us to buy in. They want to try and be accurate. They want us to realize, like, this is what our world looks like. This is what's happening in our world, right? So they do want to have that sense of accuracy and authenticity in a documentary. Otherwise, you lose your audience, right? If your audience is feeling like, wow, this seems like a lot of, we're really getting a very limited viewpoint here. We're really getting some sort of overblown and very carefully choose statistics. If you feel very manipulated, then right, that you're going to lose your audience, right? So, and it's not to say that doesn't happen in some documentaries. They absolutely do. Like I said, some documentaries are very propagandistic, and that can be something to analyze and look at. So they are argumentative and they make claims upon our shared reality. So those are kind of three characteristics about real people and real events. They're not necessarily purely objective. They have a point of view, right? And they have a perspective. Um, and they have that kind of activist impulse. But what is the difference between this idea of fact and truth? I don't mean to get super philosophical here, but this is something that I think is important to think about. The kind of truth we're talking about is not necessarily facts, but that truth where we say, so and so speaking truth, or true that, or that rings true. What we mean when we say that usually is not that, oh, that's a fact. I mean, in many cases it might be, but it also has a connection to this idea that it tells us something that's accurate to our reality. And it's usually something that maybe people don't realize, or that we don't talk about, or that people don't quite understand. And you're like, you know what, true that, because you're getting at it right there. You're putting your finger on something that is part of our reality. So I wanted to bring in, I talked a little bit about Tim O'Brien last module. I'm not, I don't own stock in Tim O'Brien Incorporated or anything. Um, but he has this piece, and it's a fiction piece. It's not a documentary, but where he talks about truth, right? So he says, I just wanted to read through this. And it's not that this is a documentary film or example of a documentary film. It's not. It's a book. It's a book of fiction. Well, it's kind of interesting what they categorize. They probably categorize it as a book of nonfiction, right? It's stories of him, or stories of his Vietnam War experience. But here he has this whole story called "How to Tell a True War Story," and he's basically talking about different kinds of truth, right? So he says, in many cases, a true war story cannot be believed. If you believe it, be skeptical. It's a question of credibility, and that credibility could be sort of authenticity. Often the crazy stuff is true and the normal stuff isn't, because the normal stuff is necessary to make you believe the truly incredible craziness. For example, we've all heard this one. Four guys go down a trail, a grenade sails out, one guy jumps on it and takes the blast and saves his buddies. Is it true? The answer matters. You'd feel cheated if it never happened. Without the grounding in reality, it's just a trite bit of puffery, pure Hollywood, untrue in the way all such stories are untrue. Yet, even if it did happen, and maybe it did, anything's possible. Even then, you know it can't be true, because a true war story does not depend upon that kind of truth. So I know this is a little like confusing, and he's purposely kind of getting us to like let go of this idea of truth tied to idea of fact. Happeningness is irrelevant, right? A thing may happen and be a total lie. Another thing may not happen and be truer than the truth. For example, four guys go down a trail, a grenade sails out, one guy jumps on it and takes the blast, but it's a killer grenade and everybody dies anyway. Before they die, though, one of the dead guys says, "The fuck you do that for?" And the jumper says, "Story of my life, man." And the other guy starts to smile, but he's dead. That's a true story that never happened. Now, what Tim O'Brien is doing here, well, let me finish this. He says, so true war stories do not generalize. They do not indulge in abstraction. For example, war is hell. As a moral declaration, the old truism seems perfectly true, and yet because it abstracts, because it generalizes, I can't believe it with my stomach. Nothing turns inside. It comes down to gut instinct. A true war story, if truly told, makes the stomach believe. Now, what I like about this is this idea of truth, right? Well, it's like if a documentary was pure fact, right? Let's say it was just a list of all these facts and statistics on the screen. That's not really going to get you to emotionally connect and buy in. So there is some aspects of documentaries, which we talked about already, that isn't just purely objective, but that O'Brien is sort of saying documentaries ideally, I mean, he's not talking about documentaries, but I'm sort of using him to think about this idea of believing with your stomach, right? Believing a sort of in a different kind of realism, right? That it's realistic, it really hits home. So we might think about this kind of realism that documentaries are striving for, that have a kind of emotional truth, right? Like you feel like, and that I would say is that kind of, they have an emotional truth in terms of they connect with our sense of humanity and our sense of reality, right? Like that has that pathos, right? It's not overly sappy, it's not overly, horrifying necessarily. It's not overly dramatic, but it has a certain emotional truth to it. It has a pathos truth. It also has an intellectual truth. It teaches us something, right? So I watched something like Food Inc., a documentary called Food Inc., and I'm going to learn quite a bit about the food industry and what exactly where that food comes from. Or maybe I watched OJ Made in America, the ESPN documentary, not the People Against O.J. Simpson, which was a drama with actors and Cuba Gooding Jr. and so on and so forth. That's not a documentary. Yes, it's based on a true story. It's based on real people. That's not a documentary. There was a documentary by ESPN's 30 for 30 called OJ Made in America. And that teaches you a lot about that whole situation. His not only O.J. Simpson's trial, but his relationship, um, and the events leading up to it, and his whole career, and da da da. It's very, it has an intellectual truth, right? It's very, it teaches us something about that, but it's also needs to be grounded in reality, right? It needs to have a sense of ethos. It needs to be based on real events and real people, and it should have that sense, I would say, for credibility. Should have that sense of credibility, which Tim O'Brien talks about. We also called it a kind of authenticity, where you don't feel like you're just being fed propaganda, where you feel like, and this is where we're talking about evaluations. Like, okay, is this really allowing people to really think for themselves and think critically about whatever issue it is, or is this really just kind of like over propagandizing something in favor of a particular position? So those are the decisions. We're not there yet. Right now, we want to start thinking about what documentaries might I write about. You might want to go watch a few trailers, watch a few documentaries. One thing I recommend doing is doing it by social issue. If you have no idea, you feel kind of overwhelmed. Google documentary. Let's say you're interested in education, right? And so you want the social issue of education. Then Google, best documentaries about education and learning. Let's say you're interested in the environment. Google best documentary films about education. Right? Let's say you're interested in issues of gender, right, and sexuality. Right? Google top documentaries about gender and sexuality. There's a ton of stuff out there. So, and then so we'll want to track something down that we want to write about, and move forward from there. In fact, we want to sort of have two in mind for our DB3 double takes. And the reason I'm asking you to write about two for that DB3 is because it's always good to have a backup, right? So let's say, I'm pretty confident I want to write about the 13th documentary, but I'm also going to write up about the documentary Time, as a backup, right? Or the documentary about the Central Park Five. There's also a docudrama about the Central Park Five. I think it's called When They See Us. That's not a documentary. Those are actors. Those are scripted things. There's also a documentary about the Central Park Five listener. So, anyways, we're going to write about two documentaries, whatever you want. Um, two caveats, and then I'll finish up. One caveat is just that we want to avoid writing about documentaries that are seemingly just about scintillation, right? There's a lot of documentaries about serial killers and murderers. You're welcome to write about that. A documentary, I should say, that is about that. True crime documentaries, right? A really popular genre. But you want to make sure that you have some sort of argument, not that it just teaches us how evil people can be, because that's not really a challenging argument. Most often, and the effective true crime documentaries teach us something about our culture and our society and our justice system, in a way that's distinct, right? So, you think about somebody like the Ted Bundy documentaries. You know, on one level, it's like, wow, Ted Bundy was so evil and absolutely a horrific individual. But it seems to be teaching us something about, in my opinion, it's teaching us something about our consumerist society and the way that we glorify and romanticize violence, and particularly the destruction of women in our society. Um, because people fell in love with Ted Bundy as this guy, even women, like I think a woman married him while he was in prison, which is so bizarre. Like, so it's not just about, oh my gosh, look how crazy Ted Bundy was, but one way to look at it is how that documentary teaches us something about consumerism and our culture of spectacle and the commodification of women's bodies. Um, so you want to think about an argument. Again, we're not there yet, but we want to think an argument beyond just like, oh, it's so entertaining and it's so crazy. Um, we want to think about how it relates to some social issue and teaches us something about that. So for now, try and track down two documentaries you're interested in. Don't worry about whether or not you make an excellent argument out of it or not, but try and track down a couple documentaries, and then we can go from there in terms of uh, starting to think about how to analyze these things and develop argumentative statements and analytical statements. All right, everybody. Um, kept it to hopefully half an hour here. And so looking forward to going in a totally different direction. Personal narratives are great. I'll be working on those and hopefully get those back to you no later than the end of next week. But hopefully it'll be sooner than that. Hopefully by the middle of next week. But keep up the good work. And again, reach out, use the bonfire discussion. If you have any questions, anything like that, want to start points of conversation, talk about documentaries or talk about anything loosely related to those ideas. And I'll see you next time. Take care.